Hey guys and gals, Bored now back with you, and this is going to be my review of the brand new Star Wars film. It is, of course, Star Wars Rise of the Skywalkers. It came out yesterday in the UK, although technically I guess it came out around midnight on Wednesday night, um, early in the morning. I know quite a few cinemas had those triple bill showings where you had the whole trilogy, so it obviously ended with the new film. And for if you're a hardcore Star Wars fan, I guess that's not a bad idea. And it probably works quite well seeing and like that, because then you're fresh sort of going into this new film. So I saw it yesterday as well. So these are some general thoughts. I will go into some details. So warning from the beginning: this review does contain spoilers. If you've not seen the film yet, then move forward with caution, as they say. But just to warn you from the start, I will be going into at least some spoilers. And before I start my review, I will just give you a general sort of feeling on me and Star Wars. I mean, the original trilogy I like a fair bit. I'm not in love with it as much as many people. I do find them a bit overrated. I'm not kind of the hardcore fan base. I mean, when I was a kid, I did really like the movies, I guess because everyone does, because it's Star Wars. When you're a kid, they are really eye-catching, and they play on your imagination and stuff. So I think when you're a kid, most people like Star Wars, to be fair. It's been a while since I've seen Empire Strikes Back, so I can't actually comment if that is the strongest. I know that's a popular opinion, but the original film I saw not too long ago, and it does hold up pretty well. It's not perfect, but it's an enjoyable sort of romp, and I sort of enjoy the characters, and it is a really sort of well-written sort of film with effects that hold up pretty well to this day. So it did change cinema in many ways, the original Star Wars. And then I think most people would say Return of the Jedi was the weakest of the trilogy. But certainly for a trilogy, I think it's a pretty strong trilogy, and it sort of set the blueprint. Then we have the terrible George Lucas prequels, which were just unnecessary in my opinion. And often these things, it's a commercial venture, but I mean, the proof is in the pudding. If they come up with something great and something a bit different and it moves things forward, then that kind of justifies it. But yeah, those films were just awful. I mean, when the scary thing is, I don't even think The Phantom Menace is the worst of those films, as bad as that was. I think the second film is probably the worst, and then the third film maybe is marginally better than the others, but we're talking a very sort of sliding scale here. But terrible films. I think it really exposed what a mediocre director Lucas is. And I think it's sort of, I think when you compare things and say, well, look at the cast in those films, look at the production, look at the money and everything in it, I think if you take all that on board, to me, you're looking at three of the worst films of all time, because they had the potential to be good, to be really good, and they're really, really bad. They're really boring films and a slog to get through. So that's the prequels. So obviously those films made money because it's Star Wars, but they did sort of soil the reputation for a long time. And now obviously it's a whole universe. We have multiple TV spin-offs, and we have animations and different things, because we know about the whole history. But then this new trilogy, starting with J.J. Ambrose and The Force Awakens in 2015, which I remember seeing in the cinema when it came out and really, really enjoying. They obviously got one of the original screenwriters back involved for that. And it recaptured what Star Wars was at its best in a bottle, sort of thing. It recaptured that spirit. It added some new characters who were really good, in my opinion. I really like the character of Rey. I think she's a fascinating sort of progressive character. I like Daisy Ridley a lot in the role. And that film had momentum. It was well written, it was self aware, but not to the point where you lost the sense of characters and the story. It was a very exciting movie with good effects, good action, and twists. There were stakes in it as well, which you need. So I've seen Force Awakens a couple of times and really liked it. Obviously, Rogue One is a different story. It's detached from this in a way. It's set, sort of directly after. Someone will have to tell. It's after. It might be after the original Star Wars, or it might be one of the sequels. Someone will have to tell me in the comments. But I know it is meant to connect to one of the original films. But it's in a different timeline from this current trilogy. So you have different characters. So that's a different beast. Personally, I wasn't really a fan of Rogue One. I thought it was very mediocre. Part of that might just be because I was coming off such a rush with Force Awakens, where I really enjoyed that film and the characters, and then you introduce new characters and stuff. And then The Last Jedi, which continued the trilogy, which was a very divisive film amongst fans, and maybe it's because you didn't have as many of the sort of punch the air fan moments. Maybe it didn't feel enough of a Star Wars film for many. But personally, I really liked Last Jedi. I was impressed at how dark it was at times. I was impressed with some of the themes to do with immigrants, to do with kind of class and money and stuff. And I mean, maybe some of that stuff they could have spent more time on, but I was impressed they dealt with it. It did feel like quite a dark Star Wars movie. Again, you had a good cast in there, some good action. It was an ambitious film, and I liked that about it. Maybe not everything came off well, but I did sort of get a rush from seeing it in the cinema. And so by and large, going into this sort of completion of the trilogy, I was very positive, and I think they have done a good job of updating Star Wars, moving with the times, but also recapturing some of the spirit of the older movies, which you always need to do. So we come to Star Wars: Rise of the Skywalker. And it's kind of an odd reversal now, because J.J. Ambrose, who people know from some of his TV shows like Lost, Alias, various others, he's got his own production company, of course, Bad Robots, also did Person of Interest, and obviously he's done various films as well. He did, what's that? Damn it, this is gonna... Super 8, that's it. I was trying, because it's, the technology. Super 8, and he also did the first Star Trek film in the recent reboot franchise, which I really enjoyed, actually. So he's come back after doing Force Awakens, but in between we've had Rian Johnson, who's now going to do his own trilogy, but he did The Last Jedi. So it's kind of a bizarre sort of, Ambrose is in, then Johnson, then Ambrose comes back to complete it. And the thing about that is the Johnson film was quite different to the Ambrose Force Awakens, so it is an odd sort of reversal, but maybe I'll talk about that a bit in my review. But there was a lot of confidence in Ambrose. He's a big Star Wars fan. He obviously... Most people were satisfied with Force Awakens. I mean, it certainly wasn't as divisive as The Last Jedi. I think fans were much more on board with Force Awakens than with Last Jedi. And, there's a sense then Ambrose understands what the fans want. Ambrose understands how to put these films together without fuss, almost. To a certain extent, it's a space adventure, so you don't want too much fuss in there. And although obviously, I mean, I'll get to Lost, one of his TV shows, another day, because that is something I'm really looking forward to reviewing on the channel. At the same time, he started Lost, but then kind of after a small time handed it over more to Damon Lindelof and others. So my thing with Ambrose is I think he's very good at concepts. He's good at coming up with unique ideas. And he's a solid director. I don't know if I'd say he's a great director, but he's a solid director. But over time, I think he is more a short-term sort of guy in a way. So it's sort of odd because someone picked me up on this the other night. But in a way, although obviously Lost is kind of, in my opinion, a masterpiece and amazing and one of the best TV shows ever, in my opinion, I should say. That has its critics as well, but I absolutely love Lost. In a way, you have to say he only really started it, and obviously he deserves credit for the concept, and I'm sure he contributed a lot of good stuff to it, but I think the bulk of the credit for how great it became goes more down to Lindelof and other people. In my opinion, I could be wrong on that, but I know he did hand over. So I do wonder if, in a funny sort of way, if Ambrose is more suited to the one-off sort of film type thing. Of course, in this case, it's a trilogy, it's an ongoing, but I think each part has to stand alone, although it continues. So I'm waffling already. So Ambrose is back. He also co-wrote the script. And it picks up basically a year after the last battle. So we still have Rey in like Jedi training. So we've gone, obviously Luke has passed on. So now his sister Layla, of course Carrie Fisher, the late Carrie Fisher, is continuing Rey's training. We get a very brief sort of sequence with them sort of training. But at the same time, the focus also switches to Kylo Ren, the Adam Driver, who's so good in that role. And he sort of finds out then the whole thing in the previous film, The Last Jedi, with Snoke, was a bit of a political play on the part of Palpatine. It was basically Snook, played by Andy Serkis, was used as a puppet, sort of for him to gain power, sort of thing, and to manipulate the system of the Last Order. So the idea is that he used it as a way to manipulate Kylo Ren to the dark side, so to speak. And at the start of this film, Palpatine convinces Ren to obviously he can connect to Rey, through psychic powers and transport there. So he convinces Ren to contact Rey. Confusing, names sound similar, folks. And to try and try to convince her to move over to the dark side. At the same time, you have Poe, Chewbacca, and the rest. They get like a bit of information from a mole in the First Order what Palpatine's plan is, and they set off on a mission to try and prevent it, to try and get to Rey, to try and support all the rest of it. Sets off, and at the same time Palpatine has unleashed this new army of fighters, so it becomes a whole mass sort of battle, but it sort of builds to it. There's this whole other stuff going on with Rey and Ren once again. So before I get into some details, my overall thoughts, I was really disappointed. This felt a bit like a damp squid. It felt like a bit of an anticlimax, even though a lot of stuff happens and it's a real dramatic build and end to the film. Yeah, it just felt really, really flat, really, really weak. It just felt like a lot of it didn't add up, and it went for an awful long time without really achieving that much, and I just wasn't as invested in the characters as I have been previously. And it just felt like Whereas in the last film, I think they got around this. It just felt like the gimmicks of Star Wars and all the forced in merchandise and things like that. And fans aren't going to complain about that. They're kind of there for that, I think, in a lot of cases. But that stuff stood out to me a lot more in this film for some reason. I can't say why. I think if you are a fan, chances are you're going to like it. Although I've heard divisive things, but it seems to have a lot more of those big punch the air style moments. A lot of like the in sort of jokes, a lot of the nods to the fans, which maybe Last Jedi didn't have so much. I think that's fair to say. So I can see this giving fans like this big emotional conclusion to this trilogy. And, I can see that. But for me personally, I thought it felt like a step backwards and it just didn't feel as exciting or interesting as the previous films. I just think the storytelling is quite weak ultimately. There's a lot of fluff near the beginning of the film, which I feel could be cut out. I think just scenes and characters that don't really add anything, or they're not given enough time. I mean, maybe because obviously it's an ongoing universe and we know this isn't the end of it, it's just the end of this particular. So who knows, they might be setting things up for future films. But yeah, I just thought the writing was very poor, and you had all these different characters fighting for space, and there wasn't enough time for all of them. A lot of them weren't given the time to grow. And I'll get to some of the plot twists and stuff, which just didn't quite add up, or just felt full. I mean, the whole thing with Kylo Ren, I just felt, yeah, is this really that convincing? I mean, now knowing the truth, would he really go along with this? I mean, it's a very, at this point he has been very manipulated. So, and it's interesting that, like, the idea of politics in this universe is a very interesting idea. But I think this movie, more than the other two movies in the trilogy, just felt like excuses. They just come up with a half-baked sort of answer to, oh, this happens because of this. And it's never quite as convincing. I think in the other two movies, I mean, obviously there was more happening in Last Jedi than there was in Force Awakens. But I think there was pretty sound logic in both those movies to things that happened. I thought so anyway. And not so much in this. And I think some of it just feels like too deja vu. I mean, I know Layla wasn't training Rey in the last film, and I know Layla. I mean, there's a lot of talk. Obviously, Carrie Fisher passed on a few years ago, so they are obviously using now, digital, technology to have her in these. But, she is such a big part of the Star Wars universe. She would want to be part of these films. I mean, if they continued it after this, then maybe you would say that they're pushing the point and they should just leave it. But I think she started this trilogy, so she would want to be there by the end. And again, they're working around the fact that it's not physically because she's in and out of the film, and they do give her quite a nice important where she sort of sacrifices herself. But then that's become a bit of a thing where, well, it's the passing of the torch, so spoilers for Force Awakens, but you probably already know this. Han Solo is no longer around. He got killed off in that. We obviously lost Luke, who we see in spirit form in the last film. And so Carrie Fisher sort of finds Sue, and that's become a bit of a cliche, just killing them off just because it's passing the torch. And it's a way to raise stakes as well, but you don't necessarily have to do it with all three of the originals, like, lead characters. See, when it happened to Han in Force Awakens, that was a great moment. I didn't see that moment coming, and they just handled it really well, and the fallout, like Chewbacca's reaction. It was just brilliant. It was a brilliant moment in that film. And it's just become a bit more clear. I mean, I love the stuff they did with Luke actually in the last film, but it's just becoming a bit cliche now. Just have sacrifice in the original, and they don't do much with Layla in this. They probably could have cut the stuff with her and Rey at the start, and then okay, she sacrifices herself, but at the end to sort of save Rey, to save Kylo, but it's all a bit, yeah. But I'll get on to more of that stuff. But there is a lot of fluff before we get into the main mission. I think once you get in the back half, second half film, I think is a much better film. So I don't want to say this is a terrible film. I did see one headline: "This is the worst Star Wars film." Don't talk shit. That's absolute nonsense. It is not the worst Star Wars film ever because, hey, the prequels exist. The prequels exist. That's the one. It's not the worst Star Wars ever. So that's rubbish. But divisive reviews anyway. But we have to look at really some of the details, some of the twists. So we're in spoiler zone now. So the mole turns out to be the Dermal Gleeson character who's been in the I can't remember if he was in Force Awakens. He was certainly in Last Jedi. So one of the high-ranking sort of commanders of the Last Order. And it just comes out of nowhere. They don't really say it's almost treated as a bit of comedy. And his explanation is just, well, I don't want you guys to win, but I'm doing it because I don't want Ren to get power bait. That's so again, it's the politics, but it's just rushed, and you don't really buy it. And also, the Gleeson character is made to look like an idiot, like a couple of moments later, because he gets the Oscar Isaac character to shoot him. Actually, he shoots him in the leg, and that's quite funny because he asks, "Shoot me in the arm," and he actually shoots him in the leg, which is funny. There's some good comedy in this film, but he shoots him in the leg, and that's part of the plan to make it look like they just escaped and shot him rather than he's actually helping them. But the trouble with that is, then he's then going to be killed off. He has to face this senior officer who's played by Richard E. Grant. Great performance by him. He's not in the film enough, but really good cast. You can't fault the cast in this film. Everyone's in it. But you can tell it's stupid because you can tell Richard E. Grant is going to kill him. Because even if he buys him his story, he's cutthroat. As far as he's concerned, he's let down the side, so he's going to shoot him. But as it turns out, he's figured out he's the mole. He shoots him. That's our mole. But it's weak. They don't handle it. It means nothing in the context. I don't believe the Dermal Gleeson character would be the mole. It just feels like a twist for the sake of a twist. And there's this whole melodrama with this whole light show, this whole back and forth between Ren and Rey and Palpatine, and it's just high theatre. It's high camp. The CGI is going into overdrive, and we just get this herd of CGI and this herd and I get it's the big battle. I get then. Really, a big theme in Star Wars is to do with wars and universes, and that's actually an interesting idea. But it just felt at this point it just became for the sake of it rather than because it really justified it in the plot, and it just felt so bombastic. It's like, what the hell? It's the last film. Let's go for it. And there's some good action in there, but it's just they throw so much at you, so much into the mix. Then personally, it left me drained, and I didn't really care about it. I want characters that have time to breathe. I mean, everyone's in it. I mean, it's funny because of the JJ thing, but Dominic Marham's in it, who's obviously was in Lost. He actually looks very pretty much the same as he did in Lost, which is amazing. Kerry Russell's in it. She's got a very distinct voice, and I was trying to figure out who she was. But it's a cameo from her. She's a brilliant actress. She was in Dawn of the Planet of the Apes and The Americans on TV, was in Friends a very long. But yeah, she plays this one who has a connection to the Oscar Isaacs character, and she's in this hood and this red sort of suit, and there's a flirtation between them, and she sort of helps because at some point C-3PO has to have his brain rewired so they can use the information in it to help them on the mission. And that stuff is quite good. You get some good comedy with C-3PO, and it's quite amusing seeing him reset, so he starts afresh, so he actually doesn't know where he is and who these people. There's a lot of good stuff with C-3PO and R2 in this film, so I enjoyed it a lot. But yeah, Kerry Russell's in it, and because she's under a hood for a long time, I was trying to figure out who that was, and then it caught it. Kerry Russell. So everyone's in this film. Jodie Comer's in it as in a small role as one of Rey's parents, killing Eve. Everyone's in it, which is sort of brilliant. But it makes you wish they had bigger parts, some of them. And the core cast are good. I like a lot of the comedy is good. Ambrose, I think, does comedy well. But a criticism I have of it really is the fact that you get this self-aware humour, but unlike in Force Awakens, I don't know, it was too self-aware, or it just detracted from the importance of scenes and the momentum of the story. Whereas Force Awakens, it was very clever, it was very knowing, but it never sidetracked the story or it was a very focused film. This film is not focused. There's a lot of side things, a lot of things that take up too much time. There's a lot of hustle and there's a lot of to and fro. Another weak plot point is there's this whole thing with Chewbacca where, and this is one of these silly little shows, and I think it gets into Star Wars being more science fantasy, and I'm not a big fantasy guy. And I think this is an example of the flaw in it, whereas this might be why I'm more of a Star Trek fan, because that sticks more to science fiction. But science fantasy, so we get this scene, and it looks like something out of Masters of the Universe or sort of Power Rangers or something. And in a Star Wars film, it just looks really silly. So you get early on in the film, Chewbacca is kidnapped by the First Order, and he's bundled onto a ship, and so then you get this power struggle between Rey and Kylo Ren, where they're each side of the aircraft, they're shooting beams, so it's like a tug of war. And it looks so silly, it looks so gimmicky, and a lot of this film has that feel where it does feel like a gimmick, and it feels cheap. But the idea there is that she supposedly is seduced into the dark side, and they've warped her memory, or they've warped her into killing Chewbacca, and that feels cheap because, again, I'm in spoilers, so Chewbacca is alive. It turns out he's alive. He was on another ship, but anyway, it feels cheap. They made, just for the sake of it, they made us feel that Chewbacca was dead, just for the sake of a twist. That didn't add anything apart from the fact it continues Rey's struggle with her identity, and that with Kylo Ren. But a lot of this stuff with Rey and Ren, it feels like it was dealt with in The Last Jedi, and this is what I mean by deja vu. A lot of this stuff could have been cut, either lost or cut down, and you just move forward with the overall mission. So one positive, I think I've been quite fair on this movie, but one positive is it does return to the core themes of good and evil, and I think that's always been a crucial part of Star Wars. And to me, good and evil is one of the most compelling storylines in history, in film, in fiction. You know, that's why The Exorcist is one of the great horror movies, because it boils down to this battle between good and evil. It's one of the most compelling stories ever. There's so many things you can do with it. It never gets old. So I do like, actually, then this Star Wars return to those core themes, and they do make it a big theme. I just wish they'd done it better. You know, the execution isn't very well. The execution is very pantomimish. It's very kind of pretentious, and it's very. See, I just think they substitute magic and effect for good plotting in this, whereas that wasn't the case in Last Jedi. I mean, Last Jedi had its issues, but I felt they were always trying to do interesting things. The effects were good, but they never took away from the characters or plot. In my opinion, I think there were certain characters you could argue should have got more time in that film. Certainly, Force Awakens was a much more smoother, coherent sort of film. I mean, that was a great example of how to do a quite basic space venture. But yeah, this does become more melodramatic. It becomes more superficial, and it just becomes cheap with lots of flashy. It's a bit of a sog of film. The second half is much better. There were moments I enjoyed. I will rewatch it. I might get more on another rewatch, but I was left really cold and disappointed first time. I think it's a mediocre Star Wars film at best. Nowhere near as good as Force Awakens or Last Jedi, in my opinion. I probably will return to it at some point, and if I change my mind, I might do another review. I'm certainly going to rewatch it, but yesterday I think it may satisfy the fans, but on my first viewing, I was disappointed. So that's my review of Star Wars: The Rise of the Skywalker. A bit of an anticlimax, in my opinion. I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10. It's not terrible. There's plenty of good stuff in it, but it's a disappointment compared to how much I enjoyed the previous two films. So I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10. Let me know your thoughts in the comments if you want to pick me up on anything and discuss it further, then you're very welcome. But that's my review, and I'll see you guys again soon. Goodbye.